Well, hi, everybody. I'm Don Stewart, and welcome to our second edition of Breaking News for this Thursday. It is the 13th day of November, 2025. And in the headlines are three very important stories. And the outcome of these three stories are going to go a long way to determine the short-term makeup of the Middle East, who's going to be on whose side, what's going to be where. And so they're very important stories. They're unresolved issues, but as we're going to see today, we're getting closer and closer to the resolution here. So let's see what they are and explain where we're at. All right. First of all, new U.S. plan for Gaza stabilization force includes a possible path to a Palestinian state. Did you get that? That's from YNET. It's a U.S. plan for Gaza stabilization, and they're going to push, it's in the plan, a possible path to a Palestinian state. That's a real worry for Israel. Speaking of that, from the Jerusalem Post, Donald Trump seeks progress on Israel-Saudi normalizations ahead of the visit of the Crown Prince in 5 days. MBS Mohammed bin Salman. The White House meeting, one of the items on the agenda is, you guessed it, relationships with Israel. But first and foremost, Israel must agree to, down the line, push and help a Palestinian state come into existence. And finally, a third headline. This is a really interesting story. It's from a guest blogger from the Times of Israel. And the title is very clever, The Tunnel of Comeuppance. And of course, that speaks of these 100 to 200 Hamas terrorist murderers. They're in this tunnel, and they're on the Israeli side, sad for them, on the Gaza Strip, where they are stuck in these tunnels, and they've got to find out, what to do with them. And there's a real issue between the United States, Hamas, Israel, Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, all these nations trying to put together something that resolves this issue. So we're going to talk about that because they all have something to do with, what's going to take place in the near future. As we're going to see, the person who wrote this editorial is very, very good, this blog, and I really like what he did. So we'll get to that in a minute. All right, so we have two stories, one on U.S. plans for Gaza and the other on agreement between Israel and the Saudis that are both pushing a Palestinian state. And of course, the excellent summation of the tunnel problem. What these stories do, what we do here every day, twice a day, they continue to reinforce the truth of the accuracy of the biblical predictions of the last days. Israel, while being pressured from so many different directions, continues to be forced into compromise. The nations of the Middle East are demanding a Palestinian state, which, of course, if it came into being, would mean the end to Israel, the destruction of Israel. That's why they're never going to go for it. But the United States has not proven to be a friend either, because some of the things they're pushing right now would be to Israel's detriment. Now, we document this in our book, 25 Signs. We're near the end. The book is a free download from our website, Educating Our World, under the heading of Bible Prophecy. And some of the signs we see in these stories is sign number 6. That would be Israel remains in the world spotlight. Sign number 7, they can't find any real peace with their neighbors. And then sign number 9, where we call it, in the last days, certain specified nations will invade Israel, Ezekiel 38:39. And we see the lineup right now being formed precisely as the Bible predicted. All right, let's look at these headlines. Headline number 1. New U.S. plan for Gaza stabilization force includes possible path to a Palestinian state. Now get this, it's a U.S. plan. A new U.S. draft resolution for the UN, United Nations Security Council, outlines the creation of an international stabilization force in Gaza. We've been talking about that. An Israeli withdrawal tied to disarmament benchmarks. And then the worrisome part, and what Washington calls a credible path toward Palestinian statehood. They're preparing to bring this new resolution before the UN Security Council that would establish the stabilization force in the Gaza Strip. Now, this is the latest draft. They've had a number of drafts so far, but in this latest one, Washington also emphasizes the possibility of what it calls a credible path to self-determination and a Palestinian state. And of course, the draft is based on Donald Trump's 20-point peace plan that was enacted and signed about a month ago. Now, according to this latest draft, a board of peace would serve as Gaza's transitional governing body until the Palestinian Authority completes its reform program and is able to assume control safely and effectively, which will never happen. The draft adds that once the PA fulfills the reform plan and Gaza's development advances, conditions may finally be in place for a credible path to self-determination and a Palestinian state. Kind of hard to have a Palestinian state when you have the Palestinians not wanting one Israeli in the entire Middle East. The proposal also details conditions for the withdrawal of the IDF from areas it currently controls in Gaza, When the stabilization force, that's the ISF, achieves control and stability, the IDF will withdraw from the Gaza Strip based on standards and timelines related to disarmament agreed upon by the ISF. Guarantors and the guarantor states and the United States are going to guarantee the security there in Gaza. The IDF would maintain a perimeter around Gaza, described as a peripheral security presence, until the territory is properly secured against any renewed terrorist threat. Now, herein lies the problem. This assumes that Hamas will disarm, which they refuse to do. This assumes they will give up their weapons, which they not only refuse to do, but they say we need them. So, not only not disarming, not giving up their weapons, but also giving up control. Every single day, as we've seen, they remain more and more in control. So, this resolution is rather nonsensical because it cannot be put into place until Hamas has been dealt with. But notice there's nothing here about how to deal with Hamas. What are you going to do? Who's going to get them to disarm? They've tried to get them to disarm through negotiation. In fact, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner both said, well, Hamas told us in this agreement they were going to disarm before we signed it. So we signed it assuming they would go into the second phase of the deal. Well, they haven't, and they're liars, and they're not going to disarm. And they continue to rebuild and strengthen themselves. So this is where we're at right now in this. But the worrisome thing is, if it ever got to this, got to phase two, which it's highly doubtful it will, what the United States is for the first time put in this resolution that's going in front of the Security Council is something that encourages a Palestinian state somewhere down the line. And this, of course, would be, to Israel's demise, to Israel's destruction. They can't have something like that because they've had a Palestinian state for 20 years next to them in Gaza. First run by the Palestinian Authority, and after 1 year they were voted out and voted in Hamas, and all it's been is terrorism for the last 20 odd years. And so uh, we get this Palestinian state again, and this is a resolution. Let's understand something that the Security Council of the United Nations alone approves. In other words, Israel has no vote or no say so in this. And there's no chance, like we say, any Palestinian organization would approve any so-called reform program that recognizes Israel's right to exist. They do not. So sadly, this has been submitted by the United States of America, which is bothersome, but which also fits sign number of 11 of our 25 signs. U.S. isn't a player in last days Bible prophecy. We're nowhere to be seen. Something is going to happen to us, and we're basically creating our own demise right now by doing things like this. Now, speaking of that, headline number two, MBS, 5 days he's coming to Washington to sign a bunch of deals with the United States. Trump seeks progress on Israel-Saudi normalization ahead of the Crown Prince. It's a White House meeting. This is from the Jerusalem Post. Now, the main issue, according to the report, is Saudi's demand that Israel takes concrete steps towards establishing a Palestinian state with a clear timeline, a demand Netanyahu has not accepted. President Trump wants to see progress towards the normalization between Israel and the Saudis ahead of his planned meeting with MBS at the White House next week. Senior American officials told the website N12. The official said it's still unclear whether a breakthrough will be possible before the meeting. This will be bin Salman's first visit to the United States in 2018. It's been 7 years. American and Saudi officials have held discussions in recent days to finalize a wide-ranging package of agreements, including a defense arrangement ahead of the meeting. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said Washington expects to sign several agreements with the Saudis during the visit. We have some good agreements to sign with them, he said, adding that some details still need to be finalized. According to the report, one of the main issues under discussion between the U.S. and Riyadh is how to renew talks on possible normalization between Israel and the Saudis now that the war in Gaza has ended. Well, again, it really hadn't ended. There's a stalemate right now. They're not killing each other overtly, but all Hamas is doing is building up and waiting for the next time around. Okay, again, as we say, and this is very important, the idea of a Palestinian state and who owns the land. We have written extensively on this in our book, 25 Signs We're Near the End, Appendix 5 and 6. The biblical answer as to the ownership of the promised land is Appendix number 5. It'd be good if you read that and understood what it says, because it's very clear. It belongs to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And who are the Palestinians? And we make it very clear that Palestinians are a made-up people. In fact, even in the 1970s, we have a quotation there. They're, the same as any other nations in the Middle East. They're not a distinct nation. Yasser Arafat, the leader of the PLO, was born in Egypt. They were just created to be a thorn in the side of Israel. So we talk about this. They have no rights to anything in this area, yet the world keeps pretending that they do. So these are important stories to know. But again, the United States working with the Saudis, now with the Security Council, trying to press Israel into accepting some type of state for these people who, by nature, have denied the right for Israel to exist. And about 70 to 80% of them, that's in the other area, Ramallah, cheered on Hamas, what they did on October 7th, 2023. All right, this last headline, I like this. It's very well written. It's called The Tunnel of Comeuppance, and it's a guest blog from the Times of Israel. The fighters holed up in Gaza are a litmus test for whether Hamas will disarm or preserve its myth of eternal resistance. And I like the way he put it here. The 100 to 200 Hamas operatives trapped beneath the Israeli side of the yellow line are more than a military liability. They are a spoiler, a premature glimpse into the next act of a geopolitical drama that was meant to unfold on Washington's terms. Some among them are believed to have killed Israeli reservists after the ceasefire and may have also taken part in the October 7th massacre. Now they are starving, suffocating, and surrounded, but their fate is not just a tactical dilemma, it's a strategic omen. Again, I like the way he put it. In a closed-door meeting with U.S. Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, Hamas reportedly gave its word it would disarm. The promise was the cornerstone of the Trump administration's 20-point plan, particularly its second phase, which hinges on Hamas's demilitarization in exchange for amnesty. But the tunnel standoff has inadvertently accelerated the timeline. It has forced Hamas and its patrons at Ankara and Doha into a corner they were hoping to avoid. Now that promise faces its first real test, not in a conference room, but in a tunnel. The 150 fighters underground are the first proof of sincerity Hamas must offer. Their surrender would be the plan's opening scene. Their defiance, its unraveling. In other words, is the plan going to unravel, or is the plan going to go forward? The optics are brutal. If the 150 surrender, it will be a televised renunciation of the very ideology that Hamas claims to embody. The image of mujahideen laying down arms, raising up their hands, and submitting to Israeli custody would be a psychological rupture for their support base. A photo op that Israel would be tempted to seize, and one that Hamas, Qatar, and Turkey would dread seeing splashed across headlines from Cairo to Kuala Lumpur. It would be the Arab world's Saigon moment, a symbolic collapse of the resistant myth. Al Jazeera's Arabic headlines would struggle to spin it. Allah's warriors throw in the towel as the bitter pill for any narrative of divine victory. It would be a propaganda catastrophe. It would be a symbolic collapse of the idea that Allah is greater, that Allah endorsed what they did on October 7th, and Allah was their shield and sponsor. It would mean that the very deity whose name they claim to act in is now letting them down. This is not just a military defeat. I like this next line. It's a theological humiliation. But letting them die is no less damning. It will confirm what many have long suspected, that Hamas's leadership is willing to sacrifice its own for the sake of ideological theater. In the group's worldview, martyrdom is not a tragedy, but it's a transaction. Death in the name of jihad is not an end, but a promotion to paradise. This cynical calculus makes the proverb, the end justifies the means, not just a rationale, but a doctrine. All right, the world is watching. Qatar and Turkey, meanwhile, are scrambling. Qatar's Tamim is reportedly exploring a rebranding of Hamas. New name, new logo, new dogma. Turkey's Erdogan is convening summits, trying to square the circle of preserving Hamas's ideological core while appearing to comply with U.S. demands. In other words, repackaging Hamas to make them sort of like they're okay now. But the tunnel has made the abstraction impossible. That's what's great about this. 150 fighters are not just trapped underground, they're trapped in a contradiction that no amount of diplomacy can bury. They are now the hostages. They are now the comeuppance. They are now the thorn in the throat of the terror lords. So swallow it quietly. The world is watching, and many within the United Nations, including the Secretary General, are wishing for these men to be granted safe passage, heads held high and arms intact. But that image too would be a rupture, a diplomatic indulgence that undermines the very promise Hamas made to Witkoff and Kushner. The tunnel is a tomb, a test, and a truth serum. It reveals the limits of Hamas's maneuverability, the duplicity of its backers, and the fragility of its ideological scaffolding that has sustained it for decades. The world is watching not just to see if these men live or die, but whether Hamas can survive on its own mythology. So, this is the rock and the hard place, and precisely what makes this movement a litmus test, not just for Hamas, but for the entire regional architecture that has enabled its survival. The Trump plan, for all its flaws, has forced a moment of truth. Hamas cannot both promise disarmament and preserve the myth of eternal resistance. Qatar and Turkey cannot play both peacemakers and ideological patrons. The tunnel is no longer just a physical space, it's a metaphor for the narrowing options of a movement and a region trapped between past dogmas and future deals. What emerges from it, if anything, will shape the next chapter of the Middle East. So well said. That's why we said this story, along with the two other stories, the Saudis, their deal with Israel, our non-deal, and then of course the United Nations Security Council, how they come up with their resolution, are all going to shape what takes place in the near future in the Middle East. So what we see in these headlines are three main issues: Trump's peace plan, Israel and the Saudis, and the problem with Hamas and the tunnels. How they turn out will go a long way to determine the short-term future of the Middle East. We should know very soon which direction things will be heading, and we'll keep an eye on that, let you know. So very, very interesting. Never ever a dull moment, is there? Always something happening. I'm Don Stewart. As always, thank you so much for watching, for being part of our program, for telling others about what we're doing. Because again, we want people to have the information, the website, the free books, the free downloads, so they can understand what's going on. So please tell others. And until next time, as always, may the Lord richly, richly bless you.